Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Henry Rogers. I am the Executive Director of the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce, and we want to thank everyone for attending. Looks like we're going to have about 65 attendees today, and we're getting there. Again, during this pandemic, we've been having a lot of these great discussions virtually, and we still have a lot of great interest, and hopefully we'll be back in person really soon. Not only do I want to thank our attendees, but many of our sponsors who have made today's event possible. The California Air Resources Board, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, SoCal Gas, and one of our newer members, Tremble GPS. I want to introduce members, actually our panel today. I'm going to start with Ms. Frances Keeler. Frances Keeler joined Peacock, Piper, Tong, Voss as of counsel, bringing nearly 4 decades of environmental experience. Her areas of practice include environmental law, maritime environmental law, and the California Air Quality Act. Frances represents industrial, energy, and shipping companies before multiple regulatory entities, including air pollution control agencies, the California Air Resources Board, the California State Lands Commission, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She has extensive experience in state and federal Clean Air Acts, district, state, and federal regulatory development, permitting, credit trading, global climate change, CEQA, and environmental compliance auditing. Frances most recently was vice president of the California Council of Environmental and Economic Balance, advocating for policies that protect public health while maintaining a strong economy. Frances led the South Coast Air Project and the Bay Area Project as a project manager, with additional responsibilities and strategic management across all SEEP projects. Prior to her private law practice, Frances held numerous positions at the South Coast Air Quality Management District, including positions in enforcement and district council. Frances has been involved in the development of air quality management plans and rules that implement the plan. He has extensive experience in permitting, compliance, and CEQA issues, and has actively involved in the state and federal programs to regulate non-road sources such as locomotives, maritime marine vessels, and ground support equipment. And today's speaker, Mr. Gideon Kracov, is a lawyer in Los Angeles where he represents clients in environmental and land use cases. His practice includes high-stakes litigation and complex regulatory matters. Mr. Kracov has worked for diverse business, labor, and nonprofit clients and as a government lawyer. He has served for more than 15 years as general counsel of the California Waste and Recycling Association, a trade association including leading recycling and waste management companies. Mr. Kracov was appointed to the California Air Resources Board by Governor Gavin Newsom in December 2020. He has also served as the governor's appointee to the South Coast Air Quality Management District, governing board responsible for improving air quality in Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties. The region is home to more than 17 million people. Previously, Mr. Kracov served as deputy Los Angeles city attorney, where he counseled the Department of Planning and Public Works. Before his public sector work, Mr. Kracov practiced at Rose, Klein, and Maris LLP, a trial law firm. They handle toxic tort and environmental matters that help shape the areas of law. Mr. Kracov started his legal career at the prominent Los Angeles firm Weston Benoff LLP, where his practice involved environmental tort defense for Fortune 500 clients. Mr. Kracov is a former chair of the State Board of California Environmental Law Section Executive Committee. Elected by his peers, he led the education and programs activity on behalf of the section's 2,500 environmental law lawyer members. From 2015 to 2018, he served as a governor's appointee and chair of the California Mining and Geology Board that oversees the state's interests in seismic hazards, mineral resources, and mine reclamation. He has chaired the California Department of Public Substance Control Independent Review Panel, tasked with recommending improvements to the agency's permitting, enforcement, outreach, and fiscal management. From 2007 to 2011, Mr. Kracov served as vice chair of the Los Angeles Proposition O Bond Committee, administering $500 million to protect the city's rivers and beaches. Mr. Kracov teaches land use and law and regulation at Loyola Law School. In 2019, he coached the Loyola Law School team to its first place finish in the 20th annual California Lawyers Association Environmental Law Student Negotiation Competition. He received his Juris Doctorate in environmental law certificate from the University of California, Berkeley Law School in '95, and graduated from the University of California, Berkeley with high honors in 1992. In 2001, Mr. Kracov was one of the emerging leaders from the United States selected for a German Marshall Fund Memorial Fellowship to foster transatlantic relationships among those capable of effecting real and lasting change. Well, Gideon, Francis, the floor is yours. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Henry.
Henry, thank you for joining us. This would be a very interesting and key discussion that we want to keep track of. Board Member Kracov, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Now, you were appointed to the South Coast Air Quality Management District by the governor, and not too long thereafter, you were appointed to as the district's representative to the California Air Resources Board, CARB. That's a lot of responsibility, a lot of impact that happens on at those two agencies in California. You took it all on in a very short period of time. What motivates you to serve on these boards?
Oh, thanks, Francis. It's good to be here today, and I appreciate the invitation from HAIC. I came to one of your meetings many years ago on, I think, the Port of Los Angeles side in one of the hotels there, and hope I can come back soon again on Zoom. I know that my colleague Rex Richardson on the AQMD board was here a few months ago, and it's not too late to have him come back instead of me, Francis. You'll probably get a better 45 minutes. But I'm happy to be here. I don't know if it's going to be more Oprah style or Mike Wallace 60 minutes, but I'm ready to get through it, Francis.
We're going to try to hit it all, don't worry.
So it's an interesting format here on the Zoom, and we've got about 35 folks in the audience. So really just want to make this as interactive as possible and as meaningful for the members of HISC, realizing how important they are as stakeholders. And these are folks I need to get to know if I'm going to be successful in these roles. And so that's sort of the spirit with which I come into this, and looking forward to the discussion today. I come from a background of, folks who have served in public service. My father was a longtime federal prosecutor back in New Jersey, New York area, and then a state court judge. So sort of the value of public service and politics has always been important to me. And I've had the opportunity both through my legal career, but also through different appointments and boards and commissions to sort of work my way up, Francis, to these pretty significant roles. I served in the State Mining and Geology Board, which sort of oversees a lot of the aggregate mines and quarries that make up a lot of our industrial infrastructure, sand and gravel, all the concrete. So learned a lot about the different rural areas of the state and stakeholders in that field. I was involved with the Department of Toxic Substances Control, very heavily regulated sector, the Exide cleanup and some issues there at the agency that we worked hard on. I also worked with one of your former colleagues at SEEB, Vic Weiser, early on in my career on the Inspection Maintenance Review Committee, which oversees the light duty smog check program in California. So, and I know Henry went through that long, unnecessary bio there, but I've sort of, worked my way with state agencies, different stakeholders, and my board members in all of these different places. Like everything else, trying to leave these positions, leave these roles, better than when I started. So I'm hopeful, Francis, that the folks at HAIC and others can say the same thing for me after my tenure, at these two agencies. This work is sort of the work of a lifetime. I was talking with one of your colleagues in the green room here. The challenge of moving to a green economy, shifting from a fossil fuel economy towards more climate-friendly ways of doing business. It's a huge challenge. The infrastructure is a huge challenge. And trying to figure out a way that works with balance for our planet, for our economy and industry, and for our friends in labor is not going to be easy. It's going to take all of our effort, and I think all of the experience that I sort of, bring to bear. And I'm going to do the best that I can with it. And also being the South Coast rep to CARB is a special opportunity. I mean, the South Coast, we need help. For those that don't know, again, it's the 18 million people in our district, all the way from the ports to East Coachella Valley. And in our AQMP, in our air quality management plan, which we passed a few years ago, we have obligations to attain the 8-hour federal ozone standard, which is going to require huge reductions in NOx, oxides of nitrogen, or smog. It's sort of like 45% below baseline levels by 2023, 55% below, I think, 2017 baseline levels by the time we get to 2031. 80% of these smog sources come from mobile sources. And it's probably even worse now with the ships queuing offshore. So these are huge reductions. Probably in the short term, reductions we may not be able to obtain in the time that we need by 2023. So wearing my AQMD hat, there's sort of this fiduciary role to try to meet these governing federal standards. There are theoretically a parade of horribles that come down for air quality districts that don't meet attainment. And that's why the relationship with the Air Resources Board, that has a big role on the mobile sources, the federal government, is so important. So it's a big challenge for me. I'm still, pretty new in the role. I can't imagine something that is more interesting and important to work on, certainly challenging, and how to do all of this in a balanced way where we can sort of, mold consensus. Folks don't often turn to our mission statement at the South Coast, but the mission statement itself says that we're supposed to do all this with practical and innovative strategies. So I'm trying to bring, that mindset, open to suggestions. I'm not going to be as successful without the stakeholders, and those stakeholders certainly include the folks on the phone and HIIC.
Well, thanks for that. That's you have quite an impressive background, and you have worked your way into some very important positions on these governing boards. And your background before, though, you didn't really focus that much on, I'm not sure with your litigation, but that much on air quality issues, and they are very complex. So what are you doing to try to bring yourself up to speed on these issues before both boards? And that's a lot to fight off.
Well, I speak to people like Francis Keeler, that really helps. I'm in my 25th year of environmental and land use practice, and have had so many different issues, whether it's toxics, water, air, come through the door there in the practice. One of the things that I think has put me in this position, Francis, and that the governor, I think, appreciated about my background, is the diversity of my background, which is a little unusual. I have done a lot of work with the environmental community, including very deep relationships with the environmental justice sector. I've worked with labor unions at many different parts of the labor movement on land use issues in particular. But I've also worked for industry. Been, until recently, because I had to resign because of conflicts with this work, but I was the general counsel for a trade association of waste recyclers and haulers. Everything from Fortune, 100 companies down to folks that are running 2 to 3 trucks. Very heavily regulated sector. The trucks, the facilities, how much waste they recycle, stormwater runoff. So I saw what it's like to try to operate a business in this regulatory climate. And I've also been a government lawyer. I was a deputy LA city attorney. It was in that capacity that I came down to HIIC probably almost 20 years ago. So, I do have sort of this balanced perspective on things, which I'm hopeful puts me in a decent position to sort of mold consensus, which is so much needed on these really thorny issues that we're trying to address. And try to find ways that we can thread the needle without mixing too many metaphors and get to sort of mutual satisfaction on the issues that we're coming before. My wife's a real estate lawyer, Francis. Sort of see things, hear things at least from her perspective as well, and can bounce ideas and off of her. And she's sort of, when it comes to ethics and humility, sort of my North Star to keep me on the right path on these issues too. So we want to give her a brief shout out because I think it's important in helping me shape my approach.
And just a little follow-up there. You mentioned, trying to bring things to consensus, and I can see that especially these days, is extremely difficult to do because I think that you're seeing a lot more, division among stakeholders, and so I can see that your task is going to be a very tough one going forward. So one of the as I mentioned, some of the complex issues that you have to deal with in your role, and one of these is the recently adopted AQMD warehouse indirect source rule. And you supported that rule, and that was passed by the majority of the board. The HIC is comprised of businesses that depend on the ports and goods movement success. The goods movement supply chain is a huge economic driver for the region, yet this measure can have some large economic impact on this sector. Additionally, a major criticism of the rule is that it's primarily focused on reducing emissions from trucks, over which the district has no authority, and that CARB is already regulating. Warehouse operators have said the cost of the rule is not justified because of this. What do you hope to gain from this rule, and why do you think the cost is justified?
Well, I appreciate the concerns of industry with regard to this rule. I certainly, heard a lot of that before the rule was adopted. In my role as a policymaker, I also heard the concerns from the communities that suffer both the ozone smog impacts and the diesel impacts from the trucks, which are sort of the focus of the rule. So try to approach the rule with a balanced perspective. We passed the rule in a bipartisan way, 9-4 on our board, which I was really proud of. I was also proud to help support the new chair of our agency, who is a Republican from sort of the Temecula, Wildomar area, Riverside County. And I'm also very pleased that the rule had strong labor support, which not all of our rules at the South Coast have. We had support from IBEW, the LA County Federation of Labor weighed in favor of the rule, because folks like me, and particularly Rex Richardson, Vanessa Delgado, worked hard with the laborers, with the carpenters, to make sure that their concerns about the rule were assuaged. And I think learning that lesson, Francis, is really important. I think as we do this transition to a green economy, as we see some of the concerns from the building trades and others, trying to find ways through relationships, through regulatory language, to build some bridges between the environmental community and labor is really going to be important. I don't know the folks, quite as well, ILWU at the ports. I've started this job with COVID and Zoom, but I'm really hoping to get down there and start building some real strong relationships with some of the other trades that are active at the ports. I could spend a lot of time answering this question, and I have some notes here, and you'll shut me up when you've heard enough. The way that I approach this issue with the trucks, the diesel is a huge problem. It's a huge problem with the trucks. It's a big problem with the locomotives and also the ocean-going vessels and some of the smaller harbor craft. And it's a problem all throughout our basin. I'm a land use lawyer. When it comes to permitting these warehouses, every one of them is a land use fight. Yes, it's because of noise and a little bit because of traffic routes, but what it really comes down to is the diesel pollution from these trucks. Every planning commission, every city council, it's a huge headache when we're trying to permit these facilities, which are so important for economic growth. Why? Because of the diesel. So if we can find ways to get these diesels off the road, both through my Air Resources Board role, also through the AQMD role, I really feel like this goods movement sector, this complex that is so important to the economic growth and the future of our region, is going to be on a way better footing, a way better foundation. So if I have the ability to stay in this position for a while, and that'll be a combination of luck and hopefully some good work, I'm hopeful that, again, I can look back on this in 10 years and say we really made progress. The goods movement industry is more sustainable than it was. It's a better foundation for economic growth for our region, for our children, for the future of California. So that's sort of how I approach this issue. Just a few points then on the warehouse rule. This is called an indirect source rule. Certainly, you know about that, but it's normally Air Resources Board at the state level does the mobile sources. The AQMD does the stationary sources, the smokestack emissions. So one does tailpipe, one does smokestack. The indirect sources are in the middle. These are sources, facilities that are stationary. They don't move, but they bring and attract these mobile sources. It is an area that under federal and state law, the air districts do have authority. San Joaquin has used this authority in their air district, their valley. So we do have the regulatory authority as the South Coast to weigh in on those sources. And the warehouse industry is a big magnet source. If you look at all the trucks that are attracted to the warehouses, it's about the same or more than all the stationary sources combined in the air district. And again, just like the ports, the warehouses play a critical role in our air quality attainment and also getting off of diesel, getting to near zero and zero emissions. And so the idea was that this indirect source rule for the South Coast was a critical push for doing that. Another quick thing, people talk about regulatory flexibility. I know that's a buzzword for CEIB, for example, who you so ably serve. And this rule is regulatory flexibility. It's a point-based system based on how many trucks come, where you have 20 or 30 different options. You can buy near zero natural gas trucks that are widely available and work really well. I've learned that from my waste clients. You could buy electric trucks or invest in quite expensive electric infrastructure and get lots of points. You can put in solar systems. You can put in air filtration systems. So there is a lot of regulatory flexibility built into the rule, and hopefully it's going to create a level playing field so that all the warehouse operators have to abide by similar standards to, again, improve the overall sustainability of the industry. I look carefully at the costs and the benefits of the rule. All of our rules at AQMD do that, and we heard from so many different stakeholders on this. The public health benefits, and the data shows this, far outweigh the costs. Ultimately, the costs are about 20 to 75 cents a square foot a year per warehouse. 20 to 75 cents a square foot a year. Now, that's not nothing, but in my view as a policymaker and for the 9 members of our board, again, we thought it was the right balance. And if compliance is kicking off now, if the rule doesn't work, if the costs prove to be higher than that, unfairly so, we're going to look at it for sure. And I commit to doing that. But again, that was my mindset in examining the rule and why I decided to vote for it, Francis.
Well, I appreciate that, Gideon, and your passion for, controlling the emissions. I think, again, yes, time will tell whether this is sustained and whether this can be accomplished, especially, the warehouse owners that were saying they have no control over the trucks. So that's still a complex issue. And you and I have discussed this before. And I had expressed my concerns with, did you go a little too far? So we will see how that goes and whether it all plays out and works. I know, having worked at the Air District for many years, that sometimes opposition is because of the unknown, but sometimes it just doesn't work. And I've seen the district rollback rules too. So we'll see how this one goes. Now, let's switch a little bit. You mentioned the AQMP, which the district is working on right now, and they should be developing some control measures. And as you pointed out, the AQMD develops stationary source control measures, and the Air Resources Board develops the mobile source strategies for the plan. How do you plan to use your dual role to help the development of the AQMP?
I'm looking at the chat here. I see a bunch of folks that say they can't see anything. I see Rick Cameron from Long Beach just chimed in there. So I don't know, Henry or everybody else, I want to make sure that that folks are getting on board. But yeah, thank you for the question, Francis. So this is the Air Quality Management Plan. It basically is a demonstration to the federal government about how we can meet our attainment deadlines, which I've already mentioned, mostly for smog, ozone, but it also includes things like particulate matter, lead, other things like that. For us, the biggest challenges are going to be these extremely strict ozone standards. Again, we have them coming up in 2023 and 2031, but we even have them going out to 2038 for something called the 2015 8-hour ozone standard. And again, this is going to be further tightening the standards for tailpipe emissions and some of the smokestack emissions for NOx. But a lot of this, again, is mobile sources. The mobile sources, trains, cars, ocean-going vessels, trucks, heavy-duty trucks, cargo handling equipment, is about 80% of the issue. And as you mentioned, Francis, we have some indirect source authority at our district, but for the most part, these are state or what are called federal sources that are mostly regulated by the Air Resources Board or the federal government. And so it's a real challenge for us from the South Coast about how we're going to tackle these things. That's why we're hopeful that the new federal administration is going to weigh in on some of these sources and do some of the work that we need, because we are limited in the tools that we have. One thing I really want to emphasize today is the good news, and that's about funding. And so this is hot off the presses. The budget that was approved, I think it was approved. I'm not privy and following all the discussions that closely on a minute-by-minute basis, but the state budget includes $2.7 billion as part of its zero emission program for 21 and 22. I was reading my notes here. An agreement for $3.9 billion over 3 years for zero and near zero emission vehicle programs. This is with B's, $1 billion. This includes multi-year investments in drayage trucks, as well as $500 million this year for ZEV infrastructure, the zero emission vehicles. And $494 million for electric vehicle charging and hydrogen refueling, $124 million in manufacturing grants for in-state manufacturing. The governor and legislature agreed to $418 million for clean trucks, buses, and off-road freight equipment. So this is once in a lifetime kind of stuff. And hopefully, fingers crossed, it's going to make my life a tremendous amount easier, jump-starting the efforts as, again, we try to make this transition away from fossil fuels in our transportation sector. So I am hopeful that these kind of investments are really going to kick us off in the right direction as we embark on the AQMP work for the mobile sources, where, again, we are constrained as a South Coast district on what we can do in our AQMP. The other part of it is the stationary sources, which is, as you know, Francis, is the more traditional regulatory groundwork and ground for the South Coast AQMD. These are power plants, refineries, chrome plating facilities. They're already subject to the most stringent regulations in the United States in our air district. So it's really hard to tighten up even further and get meaningful reductions, especially since they are only about 10 to 20% of the issue that we have for attainment. We're trying to find technically feasible and cost-effective ways to approach those controls. Some of you may know we're going through this right now as we, for NOx, again, oxides of nitrogen, smog forming particles as we try to transition from sort of a region-wide trading system called reclaim to what's called a command and control system, where we have sort of limits on each piece of equipment. We're transitioning that under our last AQMP and under some guidance from the legislature. Right now, we've done a lot of the rules. We have a real important, difficult one on refineries, Rule 1109.1 coming up. And I know that there's a lot of stakeholders engaged in that one for sure.
Yeah, and I do understand it. And of course, with this review that you're doing of pretty much a comprehensive review of stationary sources, you know, every AQMP and every review, you get minute reductions compared to what is needed. And of course, it gets more and more costly the more you ratchet down. So I see you're coming to that end, which means, yes, mobile sources. And I do see this comment here from Norman that those investments are encouraging. It would seem that infrastructure improvements would have to precede the vehicles. Very good point. And we'll get into that just a little bit. But yes, it is very encouraging to see the investments, because it is something that really is beyond the authority of the district to control. And that's where you're seeing the bulk of those emissions. And also, you know, and on that note, you know, in years past, I know when I was at the district, I thought the roles of South Coast and the Air Resources Board were very distinct. And you could say, here's where the district starts, here's where it ends, here's where CARB starts, here's where it ends. But you're starting to see a lot more overlap. And I think the ISR rule was one of those that concern and starting to bring a concern on the part of industry and regulated entities, that there seems to be a lot more overlap in that. And how do you, as a board member on both boards, what can you do to make sure we don't end up with duplicative requirements and over-regulation on certain sources?
Yeah, well, that's a really good, I think, important question. You know, theoretically, I'm supposed to be one of the folks, you know, minding the store so that we don't get ourselves in that situation. That's why I think the air districts are supposed to have representatives on the Air Resources Board to sort of bring the issues from the districts back and forth to CARB. And so, you know, I'm learning, Francis, you know, how to do that. I'm new at CARB. I haven't even been in the building yet. The whole thing has been on Zoom.
That's true.
So you know, it's the challenge. I'm just being honest with the folks on this call. I'm still trying to understand frankly, the culture at both agencies. I had one board meeting at AQMD, and then it was shut down because of the pandemic. And you know, what a year it's been. And I'm just so thankful we can all be on the participating here together, and you know, hopefully seeing a bright future on some of these things. So you know, that is my job. Again, we have such a challenge with the mobile sources in the South Coast. And as you've said, we've done a lot of work on the stationary sources. So I think increasingly it's going to require more collaboration between CARB and the South Coast. CARB is doing something called the Mobile Source Strategy, as you know, Francis, in the next 3 to 6 months, which is sort of an overall planning document, both for the federal criteria pollutants like ozone and particulate matter, but also for climate. It's supposed to be an integrated document where we're looking both at these long-term 2035, 2040 zero emission mandates, but also looking at the short term for the immediate attainment issues that we have and how to sort of balance those things out, what the technology mix is. So I'm going to try my best to represent our district well at CARB and to take the message from CARB to the stakeholders in our district. But it's going to take a team effort. It's going to take a team effort between CARB and the district, which I think in general has a common vision for the work. There are some differences of opinion, but in general, I think are mostly singing from the same song sheet. But it's going to also be a team effort with the folks on this call. We have huge challenges and opportunities ahead of us. We're going to get to the infrastructure question, I'm sure, as we finish up our time together today. In order to be successful on that, and also theoretically helping to represent the ports in Sacramento at CARB, we're going to have to work together. I want to be as informed as I can be about the challenges and opportunities that we face, the needs and strengths that we have. And I promise to really listen and work hard. I think I've demonstrated that in the year and a half I've been on the district. That was also the promise I made to the governor when I took on these roles, that I would really lean into it. Thankfully, my wife does have that job as a partner in a real estate law firm, so that if I have to do some of this work, we're not going to starve. So that's the commitment I'm making, and it's a challenge, but I'm going to do my best to wear both hats and do it in a way that leads to sensible, common sense outcomes that are consistent with the governor's goals, but also work for the stakeholders.
Okay. So in the South Coast, a major issue is obtaining near-term emission reductions and pushing for near zero, as well as technologies as well as zero emissions, so that you can meet those near terms, because I think people feel that zero is still a ways off for conversion of a lot of sources. Your predecessor, I know, pushed very hard, the AQMD representative on the CARB board pushed very hard to try to recognize those near-term reductions and, near zero emission strategies. But CARB seems not to really recognize it, just keep on pushing for the zero emissions. As a member of both boards, what can you do to try to make sure we get near-term reductions and allow some of these near zero technologies so you can get them, and then also meet the long-term reductions? And just before you answer, sorry, I should have said this before, I've started hearing rumblings from a lot of the mobile source folks that really who were pushing on hard to regulate. It's like, why would I go for near zero when I'm going to have to eventually convert to zero anyway? So will we be missing that goal? So
now you said I could skip one question.
Yeah. This is a tough one. It is a tough one, and I know Judy Mitchell, who was your predecessor, pushed very hard at CARB to try to recognize what South Coast needs, and sometimes being the lone voice there. So I think you hopefully you're not the lone voice, and hopefully you keep that up. So I'll leave it with that.
Well, let me, I've mentioned this before, but when we're talking about trucks, it's also, I think, important for folks to know, my background. So I represented for 15 years, again, this trade association of solid waste recyclers and haulers. So I was their lawyer as these companies, by CARB and AQMD rules. Again, there were rules from both in that sector. The AQMD's fleet rules, Francis 1193, transition from putting on the particulate filters on the trucks, and then the first generation of natural gas for their fleets under AQMD rules, and then where they are now. And those folks are probably running the cleanest fleets in the world. In the South Coast, they are running all natural gas trucks right now. They were on the bleeding edge in the beginning. Now they're running the Cummins engine, the 11.9 liter engine. It works fantastic. They've invested in the infrastructure. Plus, under the organics recycling rules, they have to figure out what to do with their organics. And so turning that into renewable natural gas that they can put back in the trucks that they already own makes perfect sense. So that's the industry that I come from. And when we're looking at technologies and this question of zero emission versus near zero and the role of natural gas, that's sort of what I bring to it. An industry that is running the cleanest trucks that basically are available in the class 6 and 7 sectors, but yet now there's this challenge for electric, and they're sort of scratching their heads. So I appreciate and sympathize with these challenges. And the question you pose, it's sort of, in the short term, the near zero trucks work great. They are, from what I know, cleaner than the diesel. They are less expensive and able to do the duty cycle. But on the other hand, we have sort of this long-term vision for the climate crisis and these aggressive 2035 and 2040 goals. So we have the near-term challenges, but also this sort of long-term vision, and they are not always aligned. Now, I'm hopeful that we can sort of chew gum and walk at the same time and see the future, but also realize the near-term challenges that we have. The indirect source rule that we just passed at the South Coast does allow and give points for the near zero technology. And that is a key component of the regulatory flexibility with that rule that we discussed. But let me tell you what I'm really worried about, and which I am hopeful that the folks on this call can help me with, help the communities with. Under CARB's truck and bus rule, there are 6,000 to 8,000 pre-2010 heavy-duty trucks in the LA and Long Beach ports registry that must turn over to a post-2010 engine by December 31st, 2022. That's 18 months. And 2,000 to 4,000 of those are really heavy callers and frequent users at the ports. So we've got also, there's 60 to 100,000 of those trucks, Francis, statewide. So these are old diesel trucks that have to turn over in the next 18 months. And I think we all have to be accountable for ourselves about what happens in these next 18 months. Is zero emission ready? Electric, hydrogen. I've spent a lot of time trying to learn this, Francis. I'm kicking the tires at one of the drayage haulers, TTSI, that Vic over there is so interested and passionate about the different technologies. I'm talking to Cummins and Freightliner and Tesla. I have a tour tomorrow at BYD and Anheuser-Busch. And there is a real question about whether the zero emission technology is going to be ready at the scale we need for the duty cycle in the next 18 months. What we do know, and what was presented to the Mobile Source Committee at South Coast about 2 weeks ago, is that we know about 1,200 of these port truck drivers, and a lot of these are smaller operators, have already turned over to newer engines. Of the 1,200, Francis, my knowledge is 1,150 simply bought newer diesel trucks. They didn't buy the cleaner near zero natural gas technology because it's more expensive, and perhaps because some of the regulatory uncertainty that you suggested. And very few bought the zero emission technologies, in part because of the cost, infrastructure, and perhaps duty cycle questions. So we have a problem, which is, what do we collectively do in the next 18 months? Let's just talk about these 6,000 to 7,000 folks at the ports that have to turn over. Funding is going to help. I really believe that. We just talked about the billions of dollars that are going to be on the table in this time period. Now, the Port of Long Beach is talking about its truck rate, and they decided that in this time period, it's 18 months, to exempt the near zero natural gas from its upcoming truck rate and truck fee through the end of 2022. After that, I think there's going to be a real push for zero. But they decided to exempt the near zero for this 18-month time period for the life of the truck, so folks can amortize out and get the useful life, which certainly makes sense. Executive Officer Cordero and Commissioner Weissman made comments on this that many thought were very persuasive. So I need your help in what are we going to do about these 6,000 to 8,000 trucks. We don't want this just to be another generation of diesel. It's not going to be good for the goods movement industry, not going to be good for the ports, the communities, or I think the long-term benefit of even the truck drivers. That being said, there are economic constraints, there's technology constraints. So I think we need to try to find a common approach on this that makes sense. I'm committed to be at the table for that, because I do realize that we are in sort of this technological twilight zone still, particularly in the heavy duty Class 8 sector. So we need answers, and I really believe together need to have a common approach for these folks that must turn over in the next 18 months.
Well, that's quite a challenge, and I do encourage everyone here today and everyone to try to get together with Gideon and help work on that solution. And hopefully, we can get some of that funding will help move that technology and bring prices down and make this available. A lot of it isn't just can I get the truck, but how is it going to function? So, technology development is really key here. So I do encourage everyone, reach out and work on this.
Yeah, CARB has a program trying to get 800 orders for the zero emission category by the end of the year. I'm supportive of that. I think long term, that is going to be the direction of the state, and my board members at CARB and the leadership of CARB feel very strongly about that. The governor certainly feels strongly about that. In the the short to near term, if 6,000 to 8,000 of those trucks just end up being a new generation of diesel, it is a real missed opportunity. And it's one that I'm very committed in these time periods to try to work on, hold ourselves accountable, and assess how we did.
And just a little comment. I mean, years ago when I was still at the South Coast, there was the big push by the districts and CARB to construct the hydrogen highway, and that sort of fell to the side. And I've noted that the Air Resources Board has been much more reluctant to support hydrogen and to actually do what it takes to get that developed. And yet a lot of folks would love to see that developed. I also understand that, Senator Skinner that has a bill out recently, I think it's SB 18, requiring CARB to consider the hydrogen, electrolytic hydrogen as a strategy. So hopefully we'll see some more options for folks. And again, people should get together. I'm going to jump a little bit here and go to basically electric infrastructure that we were talking about. And I'm just going to read off Lupe's comment here because it fits right into my questions. As we deal with ongoing possible electric grid shutdowns due to demands on the system, this calls into question the dependence on these sources of energy. We need to make sure that energy sources are consistent and dependable. And with that, we've seen the extreme heat in the last few years, fires, and resulting in the governor issuing these emergency orders and asking people to stay off the grid. Ships aren't plugging in. You're seeing a lot more people run their emergency generators,
right?
The usage there, it's like pull back your usage during peak demand. And this seems to be a huge setback on those dates for the drive for zero emissions. And yet CARB keeps pushing, adding demands to this inadequate infrastructure. Is the zero emission dream clashing with reality?
Yeah. When I talked about the challenge of a lifetime, I think this is the challenge. And it is the central part of my work on these agencies. And I think God willing, looking back after my service, something that I've helped make a difference on. It's almost an overwhelming challenge in some ways. And we just talked about the funding piece, and it's much better to be operating in that kind of financing and incentive environment than the alternative. The unprecedented heat waves and the wildfires, these are the predicted outcomes of a warming climate. It was 115 degrees in Portland yesterday, and it has terrible outcomes for our local air quality. So it just strengthens my resolve to be working on these issues and to be entrusted by the governor to try to do my piece. And I do think the zero emissions, a climate-friendly transition in our transportation sector is going to be critical. But you have to have the technology and you have to have the infrastructure. I had a briefing yesterday, Francis, from Air Products, which has tremendous vision for what can be done, both blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. I'm still learning what all those terms mean. I think there is going to be some mix of technologies. I often joke, I wish I could just close my eyes and come back as an AQMD and CARB board member in 2030. Maybe we'll have some of these technological questions resolved, but that's just imagination. Significant infrastructure build out. It needs to be developed in parallel with the engine technology. We also have to figure out how to include the building trades in that. I know that renewable energy jobs have increased 35% just in the last 2 years. But ultimately, the infrastructure planning, it's not just an AQMD thing. It's not just a CARB thing. It's the Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, GoBiz, the utilities certainly have to make sure that we're being careful in this transition. Now, earlier this week, or maybe late last week, the PUC, and I'm just learning these terms too, please bear with me, did what's called a midterm procurement. I'm reading here, it's 11.5 gigawatts of zero carbon capacity to be procured by 2026, with responsibility shared between PG&E, Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, and then the 22 community choice aggregators, with an absolutely huge proliferation of solar and battery storage. The greatest procurement of these kinds of renewable technologies, I think, on planet Earth. So it is unprecedented. It is overwhelming. I do think the governor and our sister agencies understand the scale of the challenge and want to be careful, not careless, as we increase demand on the electric power. And again, that's going to be distributed. Fuel cell, battery storage is going to play a very important role in that. I certainly don't know all the answers. I do know that in the port space, and we're here in the harbor today, I read the PMSA, I think Moffitt report. I think you saw that, Francis. They just did it in June. It's a lot of acronyms, but the bottom line is that the energy demands for a future zero emission ports are enormous. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to ask the terminal operators, the truckers, the other folks in the sector to make this shift, we darn sure better have the energy sources to ensure that this can be on a stable foundation as we grow. Now, research suggests that in the long run, 2030, 2040, there's going to be cost savings on this. But in the short term, figuring out the infrastructure piece, which again, I think is going to be a mix and which is going to involve a lot of stakeholders, is key. And I think the ports know this. Long Beach has its Energy Island Initiative. The Long Beach, POLA has the Energy Management Action Plans. We do need to see action, but they are committed, I believe, to bolstering their resiliency, availability, and finding ways to make the terminal operators and the whole goods movement complex successful with this challenge. But it is a challenge. I sympathize, and I'm committed working with everybody here to do it successfully, but I'm going to need your help in Sacramento, standing together and educating me on this. And I'm hopeful that I can help be part of the solution.
Great. And we just have a few minutes left, and I'm going to hit you with this thought, and don't expect a very, a deep dive into the issue. It's more of the recognition of the issue. It's not just the the supply, energy supply. It's all sorts of issues, including waste. And I know you know a little bit about waste, so. You're looking at batteries. Batteries don't last forever. There's recycling has to occur. Solar panels don't last forever. We are looking at down the road a lot of waste, besides the fact that we don't have the facilities or the means within California to take care of it. And even the demand on electricity, we're still importing some of it. So we do have a lot of work to do as a whole. And California has always been touting, well, especially the former chair of CARB, how, we're the leaders in sustainability. We're the leaders in greenhouse gas, emission reductions and that. But in order to be true leaders, don't we have to be self-sufficient and be able as a state to say, hey, we're taking care of all of the needs and all of the issues and not just pushing one forward?
Yeah, well, I think particularly in the heavy duty Class 8 truck sector, the amount of batteries that are needed is quite large. That's why I think hydrogen and the fuel cell might potentially be part of the solution in that space. But Francis, you're talking to somebody that comes out of the solid waste industry. Exactly. And who served on a state commission that in part was formed because of the Exide lead acid battery debacle that we had in the east side. We need to have a closed loop understanding of this. DTSC is part of a work group right now that I think by the end of 2022 is going to be recommending regulations to the state legislature or laws perhaps on recycling of batteries. In my discussions with Tesla, BYD, and others, they do seem to be quite committed to having a robust take-back program for the batteries. But we've learned some lessons in the past about this. We have to be careful. We have to be cognizant of unintended consequences. And with the batteries, both on the front end in terms of the mining and on the back end, there has to be a comprehensive approach so that from cradle to grave, we can take care of those things sustainably. And I do think because of the challenges with mining and other things, that there is an incentive to recycle them, reuse them, both financial and for other reasons. But it's something I'm paying attention to. And again, this is, I think, the DTSC has a whole workshop commission that's working on this right now.
Great, thank you. And very quickly, just a couple of comments. We are at the end. I think some here in this group today and a lot of folks in industry feel that industry has lost its voice. There seems to be the regulators listening to the environmental community activists and not necessarily take into consideration industry's view. How can we best work with you to ensure that we have well-balanced regulations that don't have a negative impact on the economy?
Well, the first thing I'll say, again, this was the commitment I made to the governor. I'm always available for any stakeholders. My cell phone is 213-700-4448. And if folks need to call me, they can. I'm accessible to as many folks as I can be. And, I imagine that feeling is very difficult, the folks that don't feel heard. And again, I come working with the waste industry, both large and small haulers, for 15 years and know the value of trade groups, groups like the HAIC, to make sure that industry has a voice. And that's why I'm here today and want to make sure that we have an ongoing dialogue. Francis, we engaged on Rule 1109.1 for WISPA on the refineries, the Western States Petroleum Association, and trying to figure out things that they're willing to do as we move from the command and control for the refineries or move to it. I don't think they feel like they don't have a voice. I don't think that's fair. They do. The building trades, I think they have a voice and certainly feel that way. and even the small industry folks. Our chrome platers rule 1469 just passed with widespread support because of the work we're doing even with the small businesses. So industry is a key component of this. I do bring that with me with my policy-making hat on, both at the South Coast, and I promise to do it at CARB as well, as we together learn how I can be most effective up there. So I don't want folks to feel that they've lost their voice. I imagine that's a very bad feeling, and I want to try to address it. I think it's important for industry to come up with solutions and things that they're willing to do, as opposed to just saying no. These are hard challenges we face. We need folks with their problem-solving hats on, and think about the challenges we have at the South Coast. We have serious attainment problems. We have serious environmental justice problems, and we need industry to be part of that solution.
Well, I appreciate that, and we'll make sure everyone gets your phone number, and that folks, we do encourage everyone to reach out and participate, and not just there, but also at agency meetings and that, which hopefully will be opening up the agency soon. Again, because it's so much more effective, and you feel like you have more connection when you're in person than you do.
And my board consultant, Genevieve Amsalem, just dropped her email in the chat room as well. One of the benefits at South Coast is we have board consultants to help and also be there to help with stakeholders. So I've got a fellow named Ross Zellen who's taking the bar right now. And I think he's going to continue with me. We'll see, but he does the South Coast work. And then Genevieve is doing the ARB work, but also in the time being is helping out with AQMD.
Well, I really appreciate your time and your in-depth answers, and your passion and your willingness to work with all of us. Hopefully we'll be meeting up with you soon, and thanks again for everything you're doing. And sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I think when we pretty much covered your questions. So thank you all for all our participants on the call too.
Thank you, Francis. And if the law thing doesn't work out, I do think you have a future in interviewing. Okay.
No, not quite an Oprah. We got a ways to go. Thank you. Bye-bye.